those senseless deaths that happen, like you're saying, these ones that are accidents and you can't really have explanations for it. It's not as if it was negligent of some sort. What is the approach there? What is the approach for someone who lost someone to an accident or something that really wasn't preventable? Because I feel like when that happens, I'm sure there's a lot of survivor's guilt and thinking what I could have done when realistically perhaps there's nothing you could have done. It's senseless, like you said. What is that approach to someone who's experiencing that type of death?
Oh yeah, it's a long process, right? I think one of the things that's really hard is that guilt is an emotion that people tend to minimize. So other people in your life, if there's a situation that's an accident, something like that, and you're expressing, I feel guilty, and they're just like, no, don't feel guilty. It's not your fault. Well, that doesn't give us any space to actually be able to unpack the guilt and to sort through it and figure out what we need to sort through. And so I think part of it is the work is like creating the space for it and to be able to say like, yes, anyone in this situation would be feeling a tremendous amount of guilt. And also just because we feel guilty, it doesn't mean we are guilty. And like being able to know that we need to look at our guilt, and just because we have the feeling, that doesn't actually mean we're culpable. And so with this, a lot of in mental health, there's these two big terms that relate to guilt. One of them is counterfactual thinking, and the other is hindsight bias. And hindsight bias is really the fact that once we know the outcome of a situation, we go back and we look at what happened at the time, and we think that things were obvious that weren't obvious. We think we should have seen certain things that no reasonable person would have seen. And it's like we can't unknow what we know now when we go back and look at the past. And so part of the work is sometimes how do we do the best we can to go back and really remember what did we know at the time? If we can try to set aside the outcome and what happened now, how can we really judge ourselves and be compassionate to ourselves just based on who we were in that moment, which was often a person who was doing the best we could with the information that we had at the time. And then the other piece is counterfactual thinking, which is, we go back and we often have this moment where we think, okay, if I had just done X differently, everything would have been okay, right? And we do this in all sorts of different losses where we just think, oh, if I had just stayed at home 5 minutes longer, then I would have been home and called 911, or I would, all of these things. And the reality is, of course, we have absolutely no idea what would have happened if we could go back to that moment and do something differently. There are still a million different outcomes. Maybe that person would have survived, maybe they still would have died, but we don't know for sure that it would have been this perfect situation that we imagine. Also, and I think sometimes more importantly, is that what we're looking for is something to blame or someone to blame because we want to imagine there's sort of order and logic and control in the world. Like if I could have just corrected this mistake or done this thing differently, everything would have been okay. And that makes me feel like next time I can do it better. I can protect myself, everything will be okay. When we have to accept that, like, no, sometimes we can do everything right and the worst happens, that's really hard for us to sit with. And so sometimes being able to understand that our guilt and our self-blame is actually us trying to find order and logic and control in a world where there's not always order and logic and control, it can help us to be a little gentler with ourselves and realize that maybe it's not all of our fault. We couldn't have magically changed the outcome.
There's just so much in there that you just said that I think is so important, and a perspective that I never looked at. But if you put like a title on something that I feel like I had a grasp on, but from what I'm taking from what you just said is the many important things you just mentioned was, I think, being easy on yourself sometimes. But it's so easy to, like you said, either point the blame or take blame and think what you could have done X, Y, Z. But finding that acceptance that this is the way it is sometimes, you can put your best foot forward. You can really make the best steps forward and shit just happens. And I feel like it's a double-edged sword because even if you find that acceptance when someone lost, whether unexpected or whatever, and you accept, okay, I had only so much information then, so I made the best steps I could at that time and it still happened. But then there's like a level of potential like anxiety and a little bit of being frantic moving forward, that knowing that this can happen. Because it's like a different thing when you see something happen externally on the news or to someone you know, but then when it happens to you, it's like a totally different ballgame. It just hits you differently. So is there, even for people that do find acceptance, like I did the best I could and it still happened, and find peace there, is there another level to that though? Even they find that acceptance, they still feel anxiety, that knowing that, wow, this hit home and this could happen again. Is that a whole nother healing process?
Oh, absolutely. I think anxiety, people often underestimate how much grief can be this onset of anxiety, because we suddenly realize that the world is an unpredictable and uncertain place, that bad things don't just happen to other people, they happen to us and to people that we love. And that can create this baseline anxiety for people that sometimes they've never experienced before. And so that's a space where learning tools of how do we learn to live with anxiety, and we could, I mean, spend so much time on just what that looks like for different people. It's different for everyone. For me, because I've certainly had that in my own life of having that increase of anxiety. I think most people have it after someone dies. And sometimes you can do a little bit of logical reasoning with things, but anxiety isn't always logical and reasonable. Sometimes we just have to say, yep, I'm always going to have a little more anxiety about this than certain other people. And how do I not let that anxiety control my life? How do I not let it change the decisions that I make? Or how do I not let it like prevent me from doing things that are still important to me or that are connected with my values? Sometimes we think the answer is I have to get rid of all of the anxiety. There's always, for a lot of people who've been through loss, going to be a little bit more of that uncertainty and that worry. It's just, how do I learn to cope with it and manage it? That can be the difference between, is it debilitating or interfering with my life versus is it just something that's a little bit of the product of loss and having gone through that, but I've learned how to be able to manage it. In some ways, I think it, I don't know, this is maybe me from the advantage of a lot of distance from my loss. Like, it's been a lot of years since at least some of my really significant losses. I can say that anxiety, or my knowledge that the world is an uncertain, unpredictable place, I think also helps me to value and appreciate life a little bit more. And I'm able to see that about myself, is that I know, like, who knows, today might be it. Like, none of us know what's going to happen when we walk out the door. And I think that has made me maybe make some decisions in life that somebody else wouldn't have necessarily made, that are great decisions because of my valuing of how limited time can be.
That's beautiful. And that's a perfect transition, because I would love to, learn a little bit more about your experience and what drove you to essentially, have this amazing platform in What is Grief. And feel free to, again, to kind of get into it as much as you can, but just to kind of hit the nail on the head and start it off. What did you find in your own personal experience losing your father? And I'm sure, you have other stories, what was the most difficult part of your own personal grief?
Yeah, that's a hard one, right? The most difficult part. So I was 18 when my dad died, and I think oftentimes people draw these distinctions between expected versus unexpected deaths. And I think my dad's death, weirdly, was like a little bit of both. My dad had been diagnosed about a year and a half before with a bone marrow disorder, where he was going to need a bone marrow transplant eventually. We knew that. He was listed for a bone marrow transplant. But he was himself. Like, he never got sick. He didn't look sick. Like, that wasn't anything. There was nothing imminent where we were worried he might die. And then very quickly one day he got an infection that because his bone marrow wasn't working well, his body couldn't fight off. And 3 weeks later he died. So it was sort of like, we knew he could die, and then all of a sudden he actually died. So it was a little bit of both of, I guess, both of those experiences in some way. But I think for me, when I think back to that time, people are always like, oh, it must have been so hard because you were so young and other people weren't going through it. I was a freshman in college when it happened. And, honestly, I think in part that actually, I say this now, maybe my memory just isn't great, but I think in some ways that actually helped. Like, I didn't have expectations of other people because I was like, shit, nobody's that I know has gone, I mean, a few people, but not a lot of people have gone through this. I didn't expect that my friends were going to know what I needed. I wouldn't have known what they needed at the time. And so I think it, for me, made it actually a little easier for me to go easy on my support system and for me to tell people what I was going through because I didn't expect them to know, and to be able to kind of talk about some of my needs. So I think that wasn't the hardest part. I think probably the hardest part was that my mom and my sister and I all grieved so differently that we were just all grieving so differently that I think we didn't really know how to support each other. And I look back on that now and I can see that really clearly and see really clearly how much it affected all of us. And, my mom and my sister are incredible, wonderful, loving, amazing people. But we just were in different places with our grief. And I think that made it really hard.